Hello, my name is Ari and welcome back. Today we are going to do a wrap up for my July reads, and I'm just going to be straight up with you. I read a shit ton of books in July, so I'm going to try to make this video like of a reasonable length. So I'm not going to go into really any big details on the books that I've read. If you want more in-depth reviews of these books, I will link my Goodreads below, and every single one of these books is covered on Goodreads. I write a review on every single thing I read. Most of these books I've read for Readathons, so I'll kind of go through this video under like different readathons, so there'll be some repeats where I've read something for overlapping readathons. So for July I read 27 books, coming in at 10,653 pages, which averaged out to 395 pages per book and 344 pages per day. I did take a week vacation during July and read, like basically spent the whole week reading because I still can't go anywhere. So I read for a week. I read 1 children's book, 3 young adult books, and 23 adult books. I read 13 books by male authors and 14 books by female authors. I read 8 science fiction books, 7 fantasy books, 6 contemporary books, 3 nonfiction books, 2 mystery thrillers, and 1 just like general fiction. 10 of the books that I read were for the 1960s, which is part of my Century Reads Challenge, where I read 1 book published every single year from 1900 to 2020 by month this whole year. That has its own separate video and playlist. I will link that up in the eye over there, and you can go over there and hear in details about those books. I participated in 3 different readathons this month. The first readathon, which was a month-long readathon, was the Fuckathon by Nori Reads. I will link her channel down below. And I'm just going to go through the books that I read for the prompts that they fit. The first prompt was Fuck Ableism, which you needed to read a book with a character who had some sort of either visible or invisible disability. For that I read Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susann. For Fuck Ageism, read a book with a character over 50. I read a collection of short stories called An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helen Thurston. This is about an 88-year-old woman serial killer, and this was fantastic. Like, I highly recommend this short story collection. Next up was Fuck Capitalism, and for that prompt you needed to read a book where the characters are fighting against capitalism. I plan to read Dune for that, and I did read Dune, it just didn't really fit the prompt, so I ended up reading a different book for that, and it was called The Light Brigade by... I don't remember, but the cover's here. This took place in a universe where corporations run the government, and the character kind of realized that, hey, something fucked up is going on here. This war that I'm fighting in is not hunky-dory, and fuck capitalism. The next prompt was Fuck White Supremacy, and for that I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This was a fantastic book, and I really didn't think it was for me when I read it, but I'm really glad that I ended up reading it. It's sad, it's still good. Read it, even if you don't think it was meant for you. Next prompt, I read Under the Udala Trees by... I'm really bad with names and I forgot to write them down, but for this you just needed to read a religion different than yours. This is about a queer woman in Nigeria and she is Christian, and there's a point in this book where her mother's trying to like pray the gay out of her, and it's a very interesting look at homosexuality in a nation where homosexuality is illegal because the majority of the nation is Christian. The next prompt was fuck book elitism, and for that you just needed to read a book that was like trashy, like not a literary classic. For that I read Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulle, and it's trashy. What can I say? Next up was fuck gentrification, and you just needed to read a book that had to do with gentrification, and for that I read The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and I didn't like this as much as I thought I would. But more about that in my Goodreads review. The next prompt was fuck slut shaming, and you just needed to read a book where the main character liked fucking. For this I read The Love Machine by Jacqueline Susann. I have a physical copy, but it doesn't have like a dust cover, it's just a plain black book, so I'm gonna put up something here instead of holding it up. The next prompt was fuck with yourself, which you're supposed to do something for yourself. I took a week's vacation. I already told you that. The final prompt was the group book, which was The Source of Self-Regard by Toni Morrison, and it's a collection of her essays. I enjoyed most of them, but felt that a lot of these were really, really redundant. Like, she would recycle like word for word her speeches sometimes, which makes sense if you're giving speeches over a dozen or so years, but does it make sense if you're collecting all of them into like a collection? Because you're like, wait, I just heard these exact same words like 2 chapters ago. The next readathon that I did was Becca's Bookopalathon, and I will link her channel down below as well. This was from the July 7th through the 12th, and I did a reading vlog on this one. I will link the book or the vlog up in the eye, whatever. But this one was really interesting. Readathon where you couldn't plan ahead, but you were supposed to, or 8 prompts were rolled. Like, the goal was to read 4 books in 48 hours if you could. I managed to kind of do it, but the goal was to read. Like most of these readathons, the goal was to read. The first prompt that I did was to read a paranormal or magical romance, and for that I read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It was magical realism. It fit exactly. The next prompt was to read a culturally diverse book, and for that I read The Source of Self-Regard by Toni Morrison. The next prompt that I did was to read a mystery or thriller. For that I read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which is a new release mystery, or I guess it was a new release thriller about a girl in a haunted house. I kind of enjoyed this. The final prompt that I attempted to do was to read a contemporary or romance, and I read a contemporary romance, Valley of the Dolls. I didn't finish this in time, but I got about halfway through before the timer ran out. The final readathon that I did for July was The Reading Rush, which took place from July 20th to July 26th. The first prompt for The Reading Rush was a cover that matches your birthstone. I was born in December. I don't remember the name of my birthstone, but it's blue. So I read James and the Giant Peach. Prompt number 2 was a book that had "the" in the title, and for that I read The Hate You Give. Prompt number 3 was to read a book for a movie you've already seen. And you guys don't understand how hard this was because I never watch movies. So I ended up reading 5 Feet Apart by, I don't remember her name, but the cover's here again. I'm sorry, I'm bad with names. And I happened to see this movie on a flight last year, and I needed to read this book for my Goodreads 2019 challenge, so it worked. it was a very short book, and this is almost exactly identical to the movie. So this is one of the few books that it's like you could read the book or watch the movie and you're gonna get really almost exactly the same story. For prompt number 4 was the first book you touched. I did a TBR for this where I like grabbed a name out of a shot glass and ended up reading the penultimate truth for this prompt. Prompt number 5 was read a book outside. I'm not going outside when we're all still social distancing, so I read a book next to my open window. It was a very, very short essay called We Should All Be Feminists, and it was a like written based off of a TED Talk. For prompt number 6, it was to read a book in a genre you want to read more of. And the genre I want to read more of is nonfiction, and I read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which was okay. It was a little too academic for me, kind of boring. I'm hoping to find much better racial related nonfiction books that don't feel so much like I'm just reading a textbook. But this is about racism in the United Kingdom and not necessarily, or racism against Black people in the United Kingdom and not in the United States. The final prompt is to read a book that takes place on a different continent than the one you live on, and I live in North America, so I read An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good for this prompt, which takes place in Sweden, which is in Europe if you're really bad at geography. Moving on from readathons, my book club, I take part in Belle's book club on Instagram every month, and in July our book club book of the month was The Bells by Danielle Clayton. This is young adult fantasy, and it's very, very much in the same vein as Red Queen or The Selection. It's kind of that story again, but this one takes place in Orleans, and it's about beauty standards, I guess. But it was okay. It was okay. In July, I read 3 arcs. All 3 of them were NetGalley arcs, I think. Whatever, they were e-arcs, all 3 of them. The first arc I read was Opium and Absinthe by Lydia, Kang, and this takes place in the 1920s, I want to say. The main character's sister was killed, and it was made to look like a vampire attack, and there was a bottle of absinthe found next to her body, and so she's just kind of like an amateur detective trying to find out what happened to her sister. And I would say mostly this story was pretty forgettable, but it was okay. If you like mysteries, you'll probably like it better than I did. I don't like mysteries. Next, I read Relentless by R.A. Salvatore, which is the 34th book in the Dritz series and like the 44th book in the overarching like R.A. Salvatore Forgotten Realms collection. This is not where you should start with this book. I have read all of these books over the years. I love Dritz as a character. If you are a big D&D fan and you haven't read Dritz before, I highly recommend starting with the Dark Elf trilogy and reading through it. I'm actually considering doing like a R.A. Salvatore Forgotten Realms read through next year, so if you guys are interested in something like that, let me know in the comments, and then I will definitely do that. The final arc that I read this month was called Ink and Sigil by Kevin Hearn. This one was interesting. It sounded like really funny based off of like the description of it, and I will say that I laughed. It was humorous, but the pacing was awful. It was all over the place with the pacing. There was like interruptions to the story for no apparent reason. There was like info dumpy chapters towards the end of the book for no apparent reason. I think this would have done better as like a short story collection than how it was presented in this novel form. I gave this 3 stars. It was okay. It just wasn't great. Next up, the Hugo Awards took place on August 1st. So I read 2 books of the 6 nominees for the Hugo Awards that I hadn't got to earlier in the year. And that was The Light Brigade by Kameron Hurley, which apparently I did write down her name. Her name's Kameron Hurley. I very, very much loved this book. It's a sci-fi set in a war. It didn't win, but it should have. Fantastic book. Highly, highly recommend this one. And then the other one was The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Andrews. That book was awful. The character development was awful. The pacing was awful. I highly don't recommend that one. I think I gave it 2 stars, but it was awful. Next up, my Goodreads challenge. I am trying to read the winner and the highest rated in all categories of the 2019 Goodreads Choice Awards, and I'm slowly working through them throughout the year. The only book on the Goodreads challenge that I read for July was 5 Feet Apart, which I mentioned earlier, by Rachel Lippincott. Then something that I decided to challenge myself to do in June with the Black Lives Matter movement is I noticed that my reading has always been like books that appeal to me, written for me, about non-serious topics as kind of like an escapism type thing. And I realized that I need to be a better person and not just read books meant for a white woman, and not just read fiction as an escapism, that I could use my overwhelming reading obsession to educate myself. So I'm trying to read books about people different from me. Mostly what I'm reading right now is about Black lives, because that seems the most important, but I do also want to read about other people of color. I want to read about trans. I already read a lot of fictional queer literature, so that's not like adding anything new. But my goal is to read both fiction and nonfiction that not only are about characters who are different from me, but like talk about the struggles of somebody different from me. Or even like, I'm gonna throw feminism in here too, because I don't read a whole lot about feminism. I have an outdated concept of modern feminism. The Own Voices / Educate Myself books that I read this month were The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which is fiction, Under the Udala Trees by I'm not going to pronounce it, I'm sorry, I don't want to butcher her name, but this is fiction as well. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Eddo-Lodge, which was nonfiction. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which was fiction. We Should All Be Feminist by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which was nonfiction. And The Source of Self-Regard by Toni Morrison, which was nonfiction. And then finally, I had about a week left at the end of the month where I had gone through my whole TBR. I had nothing else to read, and I did a reread because the first book in this series came out in 2010, and the 4th book in this series comes out later this year, and I've never done a reread of this series, so I want to reread it so my memory is fresh, because it's been 10 years I started this series. So the fourth book comes out in November, and I figured I could do one of these books a month because they're very large. And I could get through them, but I ended up reading 2 this month. And I read The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson and Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. This is 1,000 pages, and this is 1,080 pages. And I read these 2 books in 4 days. That is how amazing of a writer Brandon Sanderson is. That I read these 2 chonkers of a book this month. I probably had time to read Oathbringer, which was the 3rd book in the series. It's right here. I probably had time to read that, but I ended up reading Ink and Sigil instead. But I don't know how to make it any, like, less of an understatement that Brandon Sanderson is my god, and these books are so incredibly fantastic. Now, they're big. If you don't like fantasy, you're not gonna like these books. Like, this entire book is world building. You don't even get any, like, major plot drama excitement until, like, the last 100 pages or so of this book. And it's a 1,000-page book. So this is world building. This is all world building. The characters are amazing. And I think they do, like, I think he has, like, there's multiple perspectives, but it seems to focus on one character. This one focuses mainly on Kaladin, who's my favorite character. This focuses mainly on Shallan, who I like. I like her better in this book and the 3rd book, if I remember correctly, for what goes on in the 3rd book. She's okay in this book, but she's great in this book. And then I'm pretty sure, because this focused on Kaladin, this is focused on Shallan, that this is going to focus on Dalinar, and he's going to be the main character in that book. But there's multiple perspectives in all of the books. It's just the person who has more perspective time on page. You get my point. But that is it. I am so sorry for this being as long as it is, but that was a whole hell of a lot of books to talk about. I don't have much else to say, so see you in the next video.